All right. Great. Well, I'm sure there will be people continuing to join, but I want to get us started so I can hand things over to Jaclyn because I'm so excited for us to really hear more about this topic and get some really great information and have an opportunity to talk to somebody who can really help us. So welcome everybody. This is a part of a weekly communication support Zoom that we offer at Social Impact Studios on Wednesday mornings at 10 o'clock in the morning Eastern time. And I'll talk a little bit about Social Impact Studios, but I just wanted to, someone's got sound. I've got some muting to do. Okay. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Ennis Carter, and I'm the director of Social Impact Studios. We are a national creative hub for engaging people in issues and culture. And we've been around for almost 25 years. Next year will be our anniversary. And we've worked with a lot of folks in different capacities that brought me in touch with Jaclyn. So I'm really excited to see a lot of people that also have a lot of interconnections with your organization. So before I get started, I just wanted to, first of all, let everybody know that this session is being recorded. It will be shared with people who are here, but also put out on our website as a private link, not massively public on YouTube, but as a private link that's accessible from our website. So if you do not want to be recorded visually or through the audio, please mute yourself and turn off your camera. I would like everybody, if they can, to drop their name in the chat just to say you're here. And the reason for that is that we wanted to keep this open. We didn't want this to be a reservation only Zoom, but I'd love to know who's here and be able to communicate back out with you any information that you might want and that we can share with you. So just to remind everybody, this session is about honoring Native land with acknowledgements. So I'm presuming that you are here because you want to learn about or honoring Native land with acknowledgements. And that this space is for learning and asking questions and maybe even trying some things out. It is not a space for debating whether or not this practice is something that should be done. We only have an hour, so we're not going to talk about the practice in abstract. I'm presuming you're here because you want to learn about this practice, that you want to learn when, how, why, not if. So if that's why you're here, awesome, you're here at the right place. If that's not why you're here, that's okay. And you can tune into another support group if you have other questions like that. We do have open discussion for things like that, but this is not the time for that. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm here in Philadelphia, and I am curious because we've got so many Zoom. We're all doing things on Zoom that we're all in different places. And I'm here in Philadelphia, and I want to acknowledge that I am on the ancestral land of Lenni Lenape people. And so I just want to honor the elders of those people, past and present, and the legacies that have come from a long line of folks. And I am still learning how to do this acknowledgement. And that is one reason why I reached out to the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, because they have an amazing toolkit and amazing tools that I know Jaclyn will share. So to officially hand it over, I want to welcome so much Jaclyn Roessel from the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and she will share a little bit more about that and take it from here. So I'm going to, what am I going to do? I'm going to find you Jaclyn, and I'm going to make you the co-host, and then you can share your screen and do whatever you need to do. Hang on. There you are. It is alphabetical, so that's a little helpful. Wait, here we go. Thank you. Make host. All right.
All right.
It's all yours.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, yeah, Bene, it's wonderful to see everyone's faces. Let me pull up my screen now. And I encourage you, I'll keep an eye on the chat. I'll be using Google Slides, and I won't always be able to see your faces. So if something goes wonky and you can't see something, please let me know. And then ask questions in the chat, and we should be set. Okay, so I want to first, be able to start with, I'm going to drop a link for those that may be new to the practice of land acknowledgement. I'm dropping a link in the chat where you can find what lands you're on. And I'll come back to that. So if you want to look now or need to look now, feel free to. But really, for starters, so my name is Jaclyn Roessel. I am Diné. I was born and raised in the northeastern part of Arizona, but I actually now make my home in north central New Mexico, on the lands of the Tamayamna people. This is where my partner is from, and it's where we raise our son. And it's lands that I'm very, very grateful for. They continue to have medicine that's very fulfilling for me and my learning journey at this point in my life. And so I love to pay respects to that when I begin with these formal presentations, and even just like for certain meetings where I'm meeting somebody new. It's really important for me because I am a guest on these lands. These are not my homelands. It's not where I was born and raised. And so it's really a way that I kind of give back to all the gifts that this land has given me, including my partner, who is somebody who just is literally my other half, especially in this pandemic. And so much of me being able to be in this space with you is dependent on our co-parenting and our relationship and our mutual respect and love for each other. And so it's my way of giving thanks to the land for gifting me such a beautiful partner in this life. So I am the Director of Decolonized Futures and Radical Dreams at the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture. And I really love our organization because we are, in a sense, ninjas in the way that we perform the state. We are not a government entity, a federal agency, but it is amazing to see how many people believe that this is so. It was born out of a dream, having been inspired by travels to other countries where they do have ministries of arts and culture. And so this organization came about really as an imagining of what it would mean if the US were a government that actually had an entity that supported arts and culture. Over time, it has grown. And so I've been with the team now for about a year. I work on the Honor Native Land project, which really is focused at this moment around how do we mobilize and move from land acknowledgement into action, which is really what we're talking about today. I'm giving this talk as really kind of a primer, but also we'll be talking about the structural reasons why land acknowledgement is really key, especially at this point in our society, as a practice that can and should be embraced in our gatherings and convenings. And so it's also fitting to note that next week we have the tradition of the this tradition of giving thanks, and the false narrative of Thanksgiving. So there's also timing in this. So we're really coming to this from this place of like, what does this practice of decolonized practice mean in our effort to move us forward toward that? Sorry, that was a little jumbled. I am also admitting people into the room, so
yeah, I realize that. Do you want me to take back over hosting? I could just open up sharing, so you don't have to admit people in as they come in.
I think we're okay. I think we're okay. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
It's okay. No worries. No worries. I also just want to start with this question. When we talk about land acknowledgement, I think it's helpful if you haven't engaged in the practice to really think about just the question of why. Why is this important? What does it actually mean to give honor, respect, love to the place we live, to the place we work, to a place that we make meaning in our lives? Maybe you are like me in that you have landed in lands that really do nourish you in this season of your life. Maybe you are working and living in a place that you have been born and raised, so you have deep familial roots in that place. And for Indigenous peoples, it really is a opportunity for us to acknowledge the deep-seated interwoven ways that we are connected to land. As Indigenous peoples, a lot of us believe and know that we emerged from land. That is my belief and practice as a Diné person, that our creation stories relate us to very specific pieces of our land base in which we believe we emerged from, quite literally. And so when we think about the practice of land acknowledgement, I think it's important to kind of zoom out and imagine a cosmovision that is not the one that we hold collectively within our society, within this Western frame of the way that, through science or through different belief systems and teachings, or through the curriculum that we are taught within schools, of how things came to be, that there are actually ways of knowing that really have been inherent to these places, inherent to what in English a lot of Indigenous people call Turtle Island, so all of North America. And so I think that's really important. And sometimes it in and of itself, that challenge to zoom out is something that is really radical for folks, because we think about, and we're going to talk about today, all the structural reasons why this information was not integrated into our school systems, into our education systems, into our society as it is today. So it really is a radical thing to start a land acknowledgement practice. But I think the root of that is continuing the practice, is being committed to the evolution and the learning that you'll do by creating, not just saying land acknowledgements, but by treating it as a practice. It's something much like meditation, much like just wellness practices, that the ability to be in relationship and think about our relationship with land, air, and cosmos is something that can be deeply enriching if we let it be. I have on here our link at the USDAC for where you can download our On Our Native Land toolkit. And I'll drop this in the chat a little bit later too when we get to questions. But if you haven't already signed up for our toolkit, I encourage you to do so, and I'll be referencing some of that today. So I want to move this a little bit. There we go. Okay. So it's really key and critical in the way that we should kind of frame the practice of land acknowledgement, is also thinking about our relationship to settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a structural and systemic oppression that has been created by the development of the United States. The goal of settler colonialism has been, and was to commit to the removal and erasure of indigenous peoples in order for land to be used by settlers. So anybody who wasn't indigenous or born here is who we are describing as settlers. And then historically, it's important to recognize that the settler colonial agenda involved committing genocide by murdering indigenous peoples, that this was a very active policy that was engaged upon by the United States. And that agenda also included stealing land, particularly through treaties that were later broken or ignored. So today, it's really important to recognize that there are still ongoing treaties that connect the and have named the relationship, the trust relationship between all 574 Native nations in the United States with the federal government. And so that means that these different treaties are instructive of exchanges, oftentimes unethical exchanges and inequitable exchanges between the U.S. government and the United States. And so it's something that is key in our discussion when we continue to build upon our understanding of the impact of the settler colonial agenda. What is most, I think, important to recognize is that it's not an event, that it's an ongoing state, and it's something that's continuously upheld the more we continue to be involved in the erasure or the invisibility of indigenous peoples and our history. And I think it's also really critical for us to note that the U.S. would not exist, it could not exist without its settler colonial foundation. So it's really a very critical part of our understanding when we're thinking about the structural and institutional racism that exists within our society as a whole. And then the other part too is that there is also, we're talking about it specifically within the United States, colonization like as a structural means of being able to engage, a structural way of like sorting upon different power dynamics is something that is also a global phenomenon. But this is something that has happened where colonial countries have moved into other indigenous communities all across the world and have created a power dynamic that has been one based upon genocide, the removal of people. And that I encourage those that are interested, there's a really great book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, the Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, that really gives a kind of a shift in perspective of like, what does the history of these lands look like when we think about it through the lens of Native peoples. And it really is I think a helpful book in understanding that this act or acts of ongoing structural settler colonialism is something that is continues to evolve. Let me just check in on the chat. I can get it up. Yes, thank you, Natalie, for your comment. I'm glad that it's helpful. In this, I want to like recognize and tie to that the act of land acknowledgement, as I see it, can be something that's really meaningful. There is definitely a lot of discourse, and whoops, I fast forwarded it. There's a lot of discourse around the ways that this act can be performative. And one of my favorite tweets that I didn't include in this, and I should have, is this tweet from an Indigenous, just, I don't know, Twitter head. I don't know what, this is a really awesome tweet that says, my land was stolen and all I got was this lousy land acknowledgement. And it really is illustrative of the fact that, you know, there have been times, and I'm sure all of us have actually been in a space where we've listened to a land acknowledgement and it was not heartfelt. It was not delivered with any sort of like conviction or just like passion. And I always think of that tweet whenever I think about what I want it to mean, especially when I'm a visitor to another place. And so when you think about it through this land of decolonization, I think, or through this lens of decolonization rather, it really is an opportunity for us to engage in a practice that can start to undo the dynamics of settler colonialism. So, you know, to decolonize, there are courses that are taught around decolonized methodologies and decolonized practices. And this is not that, we have limited time, but really from this place of, you know, I think about it through the lens of Dr. Amy Lowentree, who is a Ho-Chunk scholar and wrote the book around, specific to museums, the practice of the practice of decolonization. And so really the way that Amy Lowentree brings us into recognition is through three prongs. That it can be, decolonized practices are something that are truth-telling. It allows us to name harm. And I encourage you, like within our toolkit, to think about this broadly, that it can be something that is intersectional. What's important for us to recognize continuously is that the US would not exist without the stolen land and stolen labor of Black and Indigenous people. Like these are the facts, right? And so to integrate that language into the naming of space, to integrate that intersectional perspective, is an act of truth-telling, and by nature, it is a decolonial act in naming place. The second thing is collaboration. Collaboration is that we're in community, we are building relationships and cultivating those relationships with Indigenous partners. That the more elaborate, and I'll expand on this a little bit later, is that we can also integrate from this place of building and cultivating relationships with elders from Indigenous communities that exist where we are, and not in a way that's necessarily extractive or one that we depend on them to do the labor for delivering of land acknowledgements, but that we're in conversation about how this practice could evolve, what it could engage in, and that in and of itself is like co-creating a process that works for you, your organization. And then the last thing is like the centering of Indigenous perspectives. I think it's important to think about land acknowledgement, and this is what we're doing right now at the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, is thinking about land acknowledgement as a catalyst toward people being involved with Indigenous rights and the supporting of Indigenous justice and uplifting of Indigenous sovereignty in other areas. So how are we connecting folks to other things? And so I, again, wanting to appreciate just all the comments in the chat. And so in terms of, are any European white colonizers practicing acknowledgement appropriately outside of the US? What's really interesting is that in places like Canada was obviously they're a colonial state, in Australia and New Zealand, there have long been in this practice of land acknowledgement, of course, depending on the administrations, like there is still a lot of resistance, and the way that nationalism and like white supremacy has really risen to the surface in a lot of these countries, there's obviously pushback in that. And in the case of Canada, there have been some regressions in this practice, but there are other countries that actually have much more broadly policies that require in federal events and what do you call it, gatherings, that it is a mandated part of the practice. So there are definitely countries that are doing it appropriately and doing it in a way that is actually embedded in some of the systemic, from a systemic perspective. I want to show you in terms of just for those that maybe, I love the framing for our session today, that this is about like the how to do it better, the building of a practice. But I also recognize that there might be some like in our call that really are still in this place of not being sure about this, if this is something that like I should do, right? Like, or if this is something that is completely necessary. And I want to share this Google search, and I use this, it's borrowed from a good friend of mine, Matika Wilbur, who is an incredible photographer. And she does it to kind of the same ends of really showing, like on Google, if you search for Native Americans, these are the images, like in the first page that you see. It becomes very apparent that they are, you know, very stereotypical. This is very much the image that Americans have of Native people. They think of like Native or Indigenous men wearing headdresses. Notice that these are all images of the past. They're almost all wearing, actually no, they're all wearing Plains regalia. So a lot of buckskin, a lot of feathers. We only have one photo down in the corner that's more of a contemporary image, but they're very much the same. This is, again, Native Americans, plural, and it really stands out when you search for Native Americans and you think about like other communities of color and culture that you search for. There is a very distinct difference in the images that pop up in our Google searches, which are very much like 1800s, like plains, black and white, or very romanticized paintings of Native people, mostly men, that are very much in the past. And they're very, very much like just complete polar opposites of what they are today, what we are today, like as a people and as a community. And so, and as all the different nations, right? So I mentioned earlier that there are 574 different federally recognized tribal nations within the United States. That means that we have different languages, we have different cultures, we have different histories, we have different regalia that's significant. And some of those, of course, are like relatives of each other when we're thinking about that many. But it goes to the point of, yet when we come to a place like Google, we think first about how many times do you Google something in just your everyday, life, and how often and how many people depend on Google for research or for just kind of finding out the facts. And so if this is what you're presented with when you search for Native Americans, it reinforces what the very little that we've learned about, like in our grade school, but it also reinforces just that mentality, this image of Native people that is being one of the past, or not existing, in relationship to that. Other facts that I think are really important to recognize. This is from the amazing nonprofit Illuminative, which is a Native founded organization. So in 27 states make no mention of a single Native American in K through 12 curriculum. And actually there are only 2 states in the country that actually have comprehensive K through 12 curriculum. There are still big challenges in those 2 states, but it's by far, there are 48 more that don't have comprehensive, meaning that they are learning continuously throughout their entire academic career about Native people too. 87% of the states state history standards don't mention Native American history after 1900. And so again, we're treated as though we are extinct. And actually in the state of Texas, part of their standardized test includes a question that actually asks students if they, like, true or false, if Native people like are extinct, and they have to say true. Otherwise they fail that question and don't pass like that competency. And Native American characters range from 0 to 0.04% on primetime television and popular films. So there's, again, this disparity of depictions, like contemporary depictions of Native people in pop culture. And again, what is reinforced are the kind of Johnny Depp caricatures of like Tonto, of these very stereotypical images and roles that are often not related to Native people in their lives. And then there are really huge detriments to the way that these structural racism impacts. When we talk specifically about Native American women facing murder rates 10 times the national average, that 1 in 3 Native women will face violence in their lifetimes. And then we break that down even further into our Indigenous relatives who are trans and queer, their murder rates, again, are like the highest in the nation. And so we come to this place of having real difficulty with the way that our contemporary image and lack thereof plays into what is known as invisibility and erasure. And let me just check in on the chat real quick. Yeah, thank you, Ines, for dropping the links in here.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that as you mention things, and
I appreciate that.
so you don't have to do that.
Fantastic. And I think that's the other thing too that's really important is I think this goes without saying, but I want to name it, is that the impact of invisibility and erasure is an intersectional problem. So we can look at, Black, Latina communities and see some of these same impacts. And so I want to stress that too. So just for the sake of this presentation and like my lived experience of being able to present an Indigenous perspective, that this comes into play. I also, want to read this quote. One of my pet peeves is people reading from presentations, but I love this quote and think it's really important because it helps us really see the impact of in invisibility and erasure. And if you have time and want, I encourage you to read this full piece, this How Racism Against Native People is Normalized, from Mascots to Costumes. There actually have been some really big wins on this front in terms of the Washington football team changing their name. Also, having happened this year, the Land O'Lakes brand also dropped their racist mascot. And so that has really helped shift and thinking about wow, what can that look like and mean if we begin to really, again, dismantle these colonial images and stereotypical images of Indigenous people and other caricatures and stereotypes of BIPOC communities in our world around us. So invisibility is the modern form of racism against Native people. We are taught that racism occurs when a group of people is seen as different as other. We are not taught that racism occurs when a group of people is not seen at all. Yet the research shows that lack of exposure to realistic, contemporary, and humanizing portrayals of Native people creates a deep and stubborn unconscious bias in the non-Native mind. Rooted in this unconscious bias is the idea that Native people are not real or even human. And so I think that when we think about the impact that invisibility and erasure has on Native people, it has oftentimes deadly consequences, right? When we look back at the statistics, when we think about 1 in 3 Native women facing violence in their lifetime. What's important to know about those numbers is that we're talking about 70% of the perpetrators of that are non-Native people who prey upon Native women, trans, queer girls, and youth, like in that number. So the large amount of people who are hurting our communities are not coming from our communities. And I want to be explicit about that. But it makes it really easy for a person to say that we don't matter if they've never seen a real life person. Illuminatives also research or shared a statistic around 70%. I can't remember the exact number, I was looking for it last night, of people believe that they've never met or seen an Indigenous person, which is not true. They likely have. We're 2% of the population. The key thing is that they likely have never seen one that has met their preconceived notions of who we are supposed to be in their minds. And so I think that's really also really important when we think about the work and how we can go through and move through this. One of my guiding principles, like in my life, is a philosophy that comes from my culture and community of K'e. And K'e really is a grounding of relationship and responsibility to each other. It is that we believe as Bala Ashla'i, or five-fingered people, that because I am human just like you, that I have an inherent civic responsibility to be better, to do better, to help you in your life, in our life, in world building, in creating a community where we all can thrive. And so to me, a lot of my work, like as a cultural justice and cultural equity consultant, is about integrating Indigenous ways of knowing and philosophies like that are inherently Diné, but that align with things like intersectionality, that we show our own practices as being ones that are inherently like radical, that are inherently embracing and inclusive of each other, that part of our obligation in and to each other as human beings is to commit the way that we unlearn these colonial ways that separate us. In my community, there are beliefs and stories that share very explicitly, like why our trans, our Nagle relatives, like trans in English, so trans queer relatives are sacred. But the ways that we have been separated from those beliefs have been very intentional, have been very effective. And so it's coming back to them. And so through that coming back and this engagement, you know, we're talking about land acknowledgement, but there are ways that that movement in learning about land acknowledgements can be a catalyst to embracing and really supporting other communities. And so all of that again comes back to collaboration. And there's this fantastic, he's now passed away, teacher, Bruce Miller, who was Skokomish from the Northwest Coast. And he had this teaching about his people were called the tree people. And he said that in my first job, I watched a film about him and it completely changed my life and just connected so many things. And he had said that as tree people, we were all given different knowledge. We are not meant to be the same tree. But the reason for that is because if we were all given the same knowledge, we would never need each other. And I always carry that as a philosophy, that in this work of cultural producing, of cultural awareness, that we all have different knowledge, and it's up to us to be able to share our medicines and our gifts with individuals. And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And that, you know, for us to be and be in this place of committing to land acknowledgement practice, that this allows us to begin to shift the culture. I think about like, well, what would it mean to be able to have land acknowledgements that are a part of like the opening session and acknowledgements that are given in Congress? Like, what would it look like if we replaced the Pledge of Allegiance with land acknowledgements in every school? You know, what would it look like if we gave an opportunity for students or for even like things like newspapers to have that line at the bottom of their web pages with, this was created on you know, Shinnecock land. What if this, what would that look like? What would it allow us to do to, again, to pay acknowledgement and homage to the fact that this land has continuously been stewarded by Indigenous people? And so in terms of questions that I hope you take away and think about in your own practice, I have two. You know, how do we continuously question and call in our work and practices? If you're already in the practice of land acknowledgement, how do we continue to do this work in different ways? I have a few suggestions. And then how do we begin to examine the colonial constructs which often restrain like the work in community? I think it's also important when we talk about colonization, we talk about settler colonialism, for those that maybe still have a hard time grasping with it, like at the base of all of this, we're talking about power. Like, who's in power? How has that power been used to erase narratives that our connection to land, the ways that we are engaging in our community? Like, so when I think that's a very a more tangible way of thinking about these things for some that have difficulty. So, you know, as we begin to transition, and actually, let me just check in the chat one more time. My little, okay. So Kristen, I'll come back to your question in just a little bit. So you've acknowledged the land, now what? I encourage people to be creative. That one of my favorite land acknowledgements, like to this day, happened a couple years ago. My friend Adriel was, we were presenting on the panel together, and he gave this, as somebody who is like a spoken word, like poet, gave this really heartfelt land acknowledgement. And we were in Tohono O'odham land, so in what is known as Phoenix. And he talked about love, like as being the grounding for his land acknowledgement, of like challenging everyone to like giving thanks to the people who have loved, like in these lands, the way that they have fallen in love, the way that they love the mountains, the way that they loved each other, like as community members. And it was such an incredibly like just powerful and personal land acknowledgement that it literally, I mean, I talked about it in all my presentations, that it was such a profound example of somebody who made it their own, and that I encourage you to do so. That you can think about what, you know, of course, depending on space, it might not be something that you present at city council meeting for the first time when you're trying to get a bill passed. But I mean, there can be a way of merging and weaving kind of the formal way that folks, and we have examples of that in the toolkit of how to put together a land acknowledgement and what kind of components are helpful in that. And so, you know, again, just encourage like you to be creative and to own it, because I think the most important thing that can be easiest to overlook is that a land acknowledgement should be given with passion. It should be given with conviction. You should mean it. And also when you're thinking about who will give it on behalf of your organization, to make sure that like if your director doesn't have the ability to give this like important statement, maybe for the first time, then have the courage to say, like, actually, like, let's have it come from this person, or call in like your colleagues in a way that is like, this has to mean something. It's not something to play around with. That it actually, for as much critique about land acknowledgements that exist around them being performative, the reason why they're performative is because of the lack of accountability that we are not extending to our colleagues and practices, like when we engage in this. So I want you to keep that in mind. There are also like ways that we can challenge, our own organizations to adopt permanent land acknowledgements at your office. So it can be something that I have actually on my email, a personal statement that names like where I'm sending this from. It names that I am on Pueblo homelands. So like it can be part of a signature, and that policy is adopted. Like I've worked at museums where, we have to have the graphics for the next and upcoming exhibition that are part of our signatures. Like, why not have land acknowledgements for where we are as an institution be a part of our digital signature and footprint, in addition to ways of having land, like if you are a museum or arts and culture organization, and knowing that we are in a pandemic, we have plenty of time to like have conversations about, well, what space do we want to co-create and like reimagine for when we do come back to work together? Like, what do we want that space to mean and look like? And how can naming place and land be a part of that? Lastly, like we can institute the practice at all of the different gatherings of your organization and company. I think that it's important to rotate, that this becomes a practice where different colleagues get the chance to give a land acknowledgement. So it's not always the same person. And I'm very much a proponent of us not picking the Indigenous person to do this. At this point, I don't give any land acknowledgements. I mean, maybe if like it was for like, I don't know. I don't even know. I don't know what I would say yes for. Maybe if it was for like Beyonce's concert and they wanted me to give like a land acknowledgement, then that would be the point at which I'm like, okay, Beyonce, I will give the land acknowledgement. But for the most part, like I want this work to be shared work. I want this to be something that non-Indigenous people hold, because it is tangible. So often when we think about the dismantling of systemic racism and structural racism and dismantling and decolonizing, it feels like so far from like, what can I do? This is something that is so tangible that yes, you might feel uncomfortable, but that moves and will fall away quickly. And so it's really important. The last thing I can say is that we can donate regularly to different land taxes. There are a lot of different land tax funds that are popping up depending on where you are. And so if you want more information about this, I can send you information, but you can go to, there are a lot of different ones. I don't have a lot of time to name them, but it really is something that can be a way to redistribute resources. There's one developing here, for instance, in New Mexico, that's the Honor Native Land Tax. And it has been working with two different grassroots Native organizations who do a lot of on the ground mutual aid and like just amazing work. And so all of their funds that they collect will be going to these two organizations to support. And so it's really just this way of naming that this land was not ours, and that if it were in other places, or we think about this idea of like rent, that this would be a rent or a tax that would be extended to folks. And so it's something to keep in mind. And I'm going to stop sharing now and see all of your beautiful faces. And Natalie, I love all your comments. Thank you. I think that, again, just this idea of like the way that we can engage in this practice in a way that is meaningful, that is generative. It doesn't have to be stagnant. And I would say that if you're giving the same land acknowledgement over and over again, I would challenge you to like, how might this be different? I've been in places where the land acknowledgement has meant is the reading of the work of an Indigenous poet, you know, so that like we want to give recognition to this land. And here are we're going to share words from this particular poet as paying homage to that. Like that is a land acknowledgement, you know, it's basically the naming of place, and who the stewards were. And sometimes depending on where you are, sometimes I get questions about, well, we have like 5 different communities. And I'm like, well, that's great. It's great that you have 5 different nations who land, you know, and obligation and relationship to the land overlap with each other. Like that's so rich, right? And so how do we challenge ourselves to not be afraid or daunted by that imperfection of like, it's not just one thing, right? So we think about our behavior as human people, like we don't stay in one place. I'm sure many of us have moved to other places, right? And so when we think about just movement as human beings, I think sometimes we're so unforgiving of Indigenous people who overlap and have connected and make our job of giving land acknowledgements a little bit more challenging. And just kind of hearkening to the words of like my grandmother, of just this idea of like the way that we that challenge is one that you can rise to, right? That it's something that you can like move into. And I think the work of like cultural producers and cultural artists is really about like, how can we rise to the challenge of this work? And there's so much in this particular moment in time that we can be integrating, that I think if we look at it as this gift and of abundance, right? Like that, that these are names of Native nations that haven't been taken away, that we still know have lived in these places. Like our knowing is a decolonial act, and our saying like is a decolonial act. And that's really like the most important thing when we think about this work. So I'm gonna drop
the link to the Native Land Honor Native Land work at USDAC in the chat. Okay.
Absolutely. So to Kristen's question about like, how do you engage with elders? I think really humbly is the best I can say. I think sometimes like leading with, you know, these are the ways that we've been engaging in this practice. It really comes down to this building of relationship, building of trust, knowing probably that depending on who you're reaching out to, that there will be some hesitation, right? Some distrust of like, oh, I don't know who this is. I've never worked with them before. But showing that you're committed in that conversation. And just say like, you know, I would love to consult with you. We have a small honorarium, right? And, you know, can we have, you know, a 2-hour conversation with you about like our practices, or be upfront and say like, we don't have a budget. I would love to honor your time. Perhaps we can, you know, XYZ. Like the idea is just really, I think, to be upfront about the ask, like explicit about what we're asking an elder to do. I have a friend who actually committed to learning how to traditionally ask for in a formal way, like with tobacco. She's not Indigenous, but with tobacco, learned how to offer that like as a gift of like reverence. I think that's the other part too, is like, if there are, you know, you can always start with gifting of just from like no ask, just, we have these really cool coffee mugs, let's give them to like a local, you know, the local Indigenous council that we know works here, or another like organization, and say like, we have this really awesome XYZ, like we'd love to share it with you. That starts a relationship, and it starts again with like reciprocity. So I think that that's really helpful. So Anita and Carol's question, is there any activity that people can get involved to make the US government fund what they stole, so you don't have to involve individuals to send you donations for land tax? I think that this is kind of something that people have been thinking about, is like, how do we I guess the shortest answer of that is like, I don't know. I don't know what that looks like for an integrated process that would include the federal government. Because so much of the existence of the federal government involves the perpetuation of the continual dispossession of native lands, right? And so it becomes a different kind of structural problem. I think what can be most helpful is the lifting up of these funds that are starting from the community. I saying like, here, like there are people who actually want to engage in this practice in a way that is regenerative and exciting, and there is commitment to like redistribute like wealth, right? I think that when we think about the land back movement, which is like growing now, which is really about handing over deeds and titles, how handing back government public land that has been taken or been, separated from folks. Those are all things that are ways that I think support this question of like activities of integration of engagement with like the US government.
Great. Well, I know we're coming to the top of the hour, and I really appreciate your time, Jaclyn. Are there other questions that people would like to put into the chat for our last couple minutes? Kelly asks, any recommendations of what not to do? That's a good question.
I think the biggest one, the biggest thing I've seen has been, don't just zip through it, like really commit. Like, I think that that's the thing is like, if you're going to do it well as an organization, to feel it. And even to name, like, I just completely believe, I'm also a coach. I believe in like leading with vulnerability. I've never done this before. I'm really scared I'm going to get it wrong. I think for people to also see that you don't have it all together, that, I saw in the chat, I could talk all day about perfection and the way that that's tied to white supremacy culture, and the way that our participation, the way that like our participation in it has to be perfect holds us back, but it also holds up the ladder of white supremacy, right? And so I think that do it with heart, and it can be messy. It's not going to be perfect the first time. I can guarantee you that. And like it will be okay. Like you'll get through it. And so just give it with heart is the best advice I can give.
And Gretchen,
thank you.
Gretchen asked, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I know we're short on time. Gretchen asked if it's, if you recommend a call to action as part of a land acknowledgement.
Oh, yes, please. And that can look like so many different things, right? Like it can be like read a book. It can be follow this podcast. It can be anything you want it to be. Like, what are your interests? Again, like get creative, like with it. If you know that there's an event, if you know that there's something that is happening in your community locally, like plug that. That's a way to be able to, again, build relationship, right? Or if you think about like something within your newsletter, that's where we're at with like the work at USDAC is like, how can we get people to action, right? Because it's the land acknowledgement is one piece, but like building toward this other future requires us to start weaving in like other things of awareness and tools. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Jaclyn. I know everybody just learned so much from this, and I really appreciate your time and your generosity with, all different levels of where we are. You're right. You're, us being able to bring wherever we are, whatever vulnerability, and being open to communicating about it. It's the key.
Yes.
All right.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
I dropped my email into the chat again, should you want to connect. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you so much. And we will put this recording and the chat transcript up on our website, which is socialimpactstudios.com. And it'll be, there'll be a link to it in that same page that you went to get into this Zoom. So thanks, everybody. I look
Thanks,
forward to
Heather.
continuing to see you all in different ways. And this Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock is always open. Drop by for coffee and conversation about how we communicate to make the world a better place. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank
Thank you,
you.
Jaclyn. Amazingness.
I'm so glad.
Thank you.